Since starting my PhD, which explores Alasdair's portrayal of Glasgow as a disappearing city, I've come to view Glasgow differently. When wandering about, visiting the places I normally would, the city's influence on Alasdair Gray's work has become increasingly obvious. At the university, I see the necropolis and mausoleum in which his imagined characters from his novel Poor Things were buried. In the West End, there are not only the physical sites of inspiration that I recognise in his work, but the very walls of the subway station, the ubiquitous Chip restaurant, the Oranmore pub have his reimagined city embedded onto the walls. When I'm at the Alasdair Gray archive, exploring his early drafts and sketches and the materials he used, I find when taking a moment to rest from the fascination of the imagined city inside the archive and look out the window, the city around me almost becomes a mirror to the objects that are inside of it. As writer Laura Waddell wrote, his spirit permeates the streets and the libraries. It colours the walls and the imaginations of people. Today I'll be using Alasdair's unpublished ledger that lives in the archive as a case study to explore how ideas transformed into new works, the interconnectedness of Alasdair's visual and literary practice, how Alasdair responded to Glasgow's changing landscape, and the value of documentation and preservation, both in Alasdair's work and in the role of the archive. For those unfamiliar with Alasdair Gray, he described himself as a fat, spectacled, balding, increasingly old Glasgow pedestrian, but he was of course so much more than this. He was a working-class Scottish polymath who, with 65 years of output, turned Glasgow into a city of the imagination through his visual and literary works. Alasdair's muse was the city of Glasgow, its people and places, and his lifetime of work can be understood as a documentation of his life alongside a portrayal of Glasgow's evolving social and political landscape, offering a window into the social realities of working-class people like himself. Alasdair harnessed a specific technique, using words and paint to create a kaleidoscopic view of what he considered Glasgow to be, a disappearing city. The Alasdair Gray Archive is situated in Glasgow and was set up posthumously in 2020 by Alasdair's gallerist and friend Saoirse Dallas. The Alasdair Gray Archive hosts much of Alasdair's literary and visual works, drafts, sketches, objects, personal ephemera, a section of his library, rug, and his famous green chair. The Alasdair Gray Archive is a replica of Alasdair's own home, so walking into the archive feels like you're walking into Alasdair's living room. Alasdair was lived by socialist values and applied the same principles to making, and the Alasdair Gray Archive echoes Alasdair's principles of accessibility, collaboration and equity. The Alasdair Gray Archive differs from other archives in allowing visitors to handle objects and works in a very tactile and exploratory way. Through collaboration with the Alasdair Gray Archive, I've learned many valuable things, like not to put coffee cups down next to historic and valuable documents, but also, more importantly, I've sort of seen the value in learning from the process of making and not just from the finished works. And what I'm attempting to do with my thesis is to use the archive materials as a starting point into how we can understand Alasdair's practice as a way of responding to the city, and how both Alasdair's work as well as the archive have preserved and reinstated some of Glasgow's lost or forgotten histories. So what can the Alasdair Gray Archive teach us about Alasdair's practice? Well, Alasdair worked a variety of jobs throughout his life. He was a screen painter, an educator, novelist and artist, and at times, to support his painting and writing, he lived on an employment benefit. Through this, Alasdair learnt the value of being resourceful, which encouraged him to think more creatively about how he would create his work and what could be achieved through this act of making. Alasdair's ability to adapt to the challenging economic positions he found himself in offered him the invaluable skill of being resourceful, which he carried forward and can be seen in his visual and literary works. In his pictures, Alasdair often painted on scrap materials such as wallpaper or cardboard. When doing so, he harnessed the colour of the material he was working on as the skin tones, painting around the subjects, meaning he could save money on excess paint. In his novels, he utilised his entire skill set, using both words and pictures to create imagined worlds in which readers could step into, and he consistently used the environment around him, with most of his work foregrounding the city of Glasgow, its history, politics and people. A tangible example of this resourcefulness is Alasdair's ledger, which he found in a skip in the 1950s. Alasdair turned the ledger into a personal and civic history book, containing diary entries, poems, early ideas for Lanark, sketches, newspaper clippings, and photographs which depicted the Cowcaddens and Garnet Hill area in which he lived at the time. The ledger shows us what Glasgow looked like during the 1950s, and we begin to see how the people and places of Glasgow were used as inspiration for Alasdair's visual and literary works. The ledger introduces us to his experimentation in fusing both words and pictures together, and how Alasdair responded to Glasgow as he felt it was disappearing around him. In a diary entry in the ledger, Alasdair wrote, "Oh, when I consider the litter of ideas and writings, doodles and deliberate sketches, fragments of verse and prose I accumulate as I live, they seem not to be an assortment of activities, but part of a single effort to redeem experience totally. For the tiniest fragment from years back may become the seed of a new picture, or provide the only detail which will complete a poem or give exactness to a scene. I have the power and the patience to reconstruct my own lost civilization from the scraps in my middens. I want my art to use all my life, make all of it significant, redeem it completely, for as it stands, most of it is in pawn to necessity, belonging to those who employed me or instructed me, to my wife and friends." This entry encapsulates Alasdair's approach to art and writing, outlining his intent to integrate his life with his art by utilising people and places from the city around him, and this city being one that Alasdair considered was in danger of becoming a lost civilization. From this entry we see how Alasdair valued fragmentation in his practice, viewing quick sketches or drafts as part of a unified effort to understand, document and preserve the city around him. We are introduced to the interconnectedness of Alasdair's practice and what became a lifelong process of recycling his work, taking the seed, as he described it, planting it in a new context, allowing it to grow, yet still rooted in the original idea. In this sense, Alasdair compares this propagation of work to the rebuilding of a lost civilization from scraps, demonstrating the value of utilising the city in imaginative ways. In Lanark, we see this idea when the main character, Duncan Taw, who, when attempting to save money to buy painting materials, realises he can eat the discarded food by the bins, and over time starts bringing a plate to put this discarded food on. One day when he's eventually caught doing this, he defensively says, "I'm not stealing this, nobody wants it." This quote encapsulates the sense of resourcefulness outlined in the diary entry, where we see the value hidden in the ordinary, less glamorous side of the city's people and places. Alasdair essentially saw Glasgow as there for the taking. The ledger now takes pride of place in the Alasdair Great Archive and is an enduring symbol of what can be gained from loss and how the act of preservation has the potential to become an art form within its own right. The consistent thread we see across Alasdair's literary and visual works is a creative response to the city. Alasdair dabbled in journalism in 1962 to support his creative practice and wrote The Mean City, a piece about Glasgow's lack of cultural appreciation for the arts. In this piece, we see an early draft of what became his most famous quote from Lanark, surrounding Glasgow as a city of the imagination. "Nobody visiting for the first time London, Paris or Rome feels in a completely foreign place. There's too much for him to recognise. He has already been to these cities in books and pictures, and if all three of them were destroyed tomorrow, they would still be visited through the medium of art for centuries to come. There is nothing so indestructible as a work of imagination, and once a place has been thoroughly imagined, it becomes immortal." So in Alasdair's practice, the city imagined is the city preserved, and we can understand this process of documenting, preserving and imagining by interrogating Alasdair's ledger, which contains many of these early fragments or seeds, which later evolve into two of Alasdair's most prolific works, one of them being Cowcadden Streetscape in the 50s, and the second one being Lanark. The ledger is arguably the genesis of these two works, however Alasdair's process, his initial seeds, were laid before. During Alasdair's third year art school, he sketched the Monkland Canal. The canal was built in the 1770s and became a crucial transport route for coal during Glasgow's industrial height. Alasdair first came across the canal in Ridgery, where he grew up, noting, "The canal proved people here had once done gigantic things, so might do them again. A wonderful idea." The Monkland Canal was closed for navigation in 1952, though at the time its remains communicated the city's industrial history to posterity, preserving that dialogue within local architecture. Alasdair could not physically preserve the canal within Glasgow. However, he could keep placing it within the frames of his pictures and documenting it in his novels. Alasdair adopted the Monkland Canal as an illustrative tool which he used and reused to document and preserve a section of Glasgow's industrial history that was in danger of being forgotten. We can see the Monkland Canal in Alasdair's painting Knight Street Self-Portrait of Alasdair on Duke Street, where he's creatively rendered the landscape, adding in a section of the Monkland Canal. We see this again in Musicians, where his sister's in the middle of a piano lesson and Alasdair changed the view of the landscape out the tenement window to include a section of the Monkland Canal, which he admits was nowhere near it. Though we can also read about the canal in Lanark, where it says, "The only splendid building he knew east of the city was the canal itself, a 10-mile-long artwork shaped in stone, timber, earth and water." Alasdair's imaginative inclusion of the canal has ultimately preserved the canal within the city's imagination and history. It also demonstrates how Alasdair picked up aspects of the local environment around him, like seeds, to transplant elsewhere. Contextually, Glasgow in the 1950s was a period of momentous change, or at least anticipated change, for the beginnings of the slum clearance programmes and relocation of communities, putting Glasgow under threat of immense social and physical change in years to come. By the 1960s, Glasgow was facing another element of physical erasure, like that of the Monkland Canal, though this time in the form of the Inner Ring Road, which bulldozed predominantly working class and industrious areas along with Alasdair's home at the time. The Ring Road was proposed in 1945. Construction began in 1965, and in the middle of this, Alasdair returned to his sketches of the Monkland Canal from 1955 and began a new work, which became Cowcaddin Streetscape in the 50s. What we often see in Alasdair's work is this creative response to the local environment, by rebuilding, documenting and preserving the city around him, or at least the city that he once knew. We can see this idea in his poem, 1st of March 1990. Alasdair wrote, "Hate change, hope teach home. Where I came to live would be where I would die. War, marriage, motorway building, separation, dry rot kept starting me anew. All I could do to stop some things going away was remake them in paint and words that also decay." This poem encapsulates a sense of fragility towards Glasgow and in making a city imaginatively. However, it also points to the ability of Glasgow's history to be preserved through visual and literary works, which is what Alasdair did. The ledger offers us a window into Alasdair's process of making and imagining the city around him. As both an author and artist, Alasdair's works seldom exist on their own. We can understand his oeuvre like neighbours, waving across the street, bumping into each other, and sometimes stopping to have conversations, complaining or complimenting the newest renovations. By interrogating the ledger, we see this relationship between the literary and the visual embedded in one place, or, in my analogy, on one street. The ledger predominantly focuses on the Cowcaddins area of Glasgow in the 1950s. However, the works which Alasdair created from this documentation were Cowcaddin Streetscape, created in 1964, and Lanark in 1981. So these seeds, planted in the 1950s, cumulatively took 31 years to grow. The ledger contains fragments of both Cowcaddin Streetscape and Lanark. For those unfamiliar with Lanark, it's a surreal and multi-layered novel that weaves two narratives together. The first is that of Duncan Thaw. He's a young artist in post-war Glasgow and is struggling both professionally and personally. The second narrative is about a man called Lanark, an aspiring writer, who wakes up in a dystopian place called Unthank with no memory of his past. Both characters attempt to navigate their way through life, and the narratives gradually merge, and we realise that both characters are just two sides of the same coin. And similarly, we see that Glasgow and this dystopian Unthank aren't so different after all. By comparing Cowcaddin Streetscape with Lanark, there are some interesting parallels that can be drawn, which highlight Alasdair's creative response to Glasgow, but also how his visual and literary works respond to one another. There are parallels in the time period, as Cowcaddon Streetscape depicts Cowcaddens in the 1950s, the same period in which Lanark is set. There's also a smaller version of Cowcaddon Streetscape on the title page inside Lanark. Cowcaddon Streetscape is an 8-foot by 4-foot oil painting made on recycled board and is on permanent display in Kelvingrove Museum. The painting contains familiar characteristics of any city, with people, buildings, streets, industries, shops and churches. When we explore the ledger, we visually see the Cowcaddens of the 1950s as a vibrant part of the city prior to the motorway being built through it. This ultimately flattened a lot of the area. We view this imagined Cowcaddon streetscape through a surrealist lens, which offers a snapshot of what life was like during the 1950s. We learn more about Alasdair's process of making through the ledger, where we can see how he's photographed, sketched and mapped out the area, taking care to capture a likeness of the buildings, despite the imaginative execution in the painting. We can see the genesis of emblems that Alasdair adopted, where he would take sketches of buildings that represent Glasgow's industrious past, such as the Monkland Canal, and also Pinxton Power Station and Cooling Tower, which he continuously used and reused. The power station was built in the early 1900s to provide electricity to Glasgow's train and tram systems, and at the time it was the largest constructed in Europe. It was such an integral part of how Glasgow functioned that during World War II it was painted in camouflage to protect it against air raids. Pinxton Power Station was eventually demolished in 1978, yet this image of Pinxton has been immortalised within several of Gray's works, including his first mural for the Scottish USSR Friendship Society, The Horrors of War, which he did in 1957. It's in Cowcaddon Streetscape in the 50s. It's on the cover of Lanark, which was 1981, and it's on the jacket of A Life in Pictures, and that was 2010. The ledger also depicts people who have disappeared in Alasdair's life, such as Alan Fletcher, one of his friends who sadly died when they were at art school together. We see his likeness drawn on the newspaper clipping in a ledger where he's copied his moustache and goatee, and although this didn't make the final painting, we can see Alan Fletcher across Alasdair's works. We see him on the front of Lanark. He's in Lanark as the character Aitken Drummond. He's a character in 1982 Janine, and Alasdair's also dedicated a whole chapter to him in A Life in Pictures. In this sense, Alasdair adopted Alan as a seed to use and grow within his works as a way of preventing his disappearance. We also see early drafts of developing the panoramic or bent perspective, allowing Alasdair to capture a large portion of the area by creatively connecting numerous streets together. The panoramic perspective in Cowcaddon Streetscape turns an ordinary streetscape into a work of surrealism, with the subjects navigating through a disorientating urban environment. The panoramic perspective turns the viewer into a subject within the painting, both observing and participating in the streetscape simultaneously. Art critic Jed Pearl stated, "The cities of art and literature are cities twice imagined, for the communal creation must be recreated through the singular imagination." In this case, Alasdair's interpretation of his environment in words and pictures fused with the observation and interpretation of others, Glasgow can become a city which lives in the collective imagination. Alasdair's use of the panorama embeds the observer in this imagined version of Cowcaddens, and as always, the literary and the visual work together. In Lanark, its mesh of metafiction works in a similar way to Cowcaddens, but instead by using language. Lanark invites the reader into this imagined world by sharing its construction with the reader. Writer Janice Galloway noted that Lanark was willing to share its power, to make me a partner in this enterprise, capable of creative insights of my own. The panoramic perspective from Cowcaddon Streetscape is documented in the ledger, visually presented in Cowcaddon Streetscape, and then narrated to us in Lanark through the character Duncan Thaw. He invented a new perspective, working from maps, photographs, sketches and memory. His favourite views had nearly all combined into one when a new problem arose. He had meant to people the canvas with Sunday afternoon activity, children fishing for minnows with jam jars, a woman clipping a hedge round an old lockskeeper's cottage, a pensioner exercising a dog on the towpath, but the locks now looked so solid he wanted them to frame something vaster. He changed the time of day from afternoon to gloaming and made a black descending dart high up between the moon. Being painted on the sky, it could not fall, nor could the crowds under it escape. In that huge multitude, only types were visible, and he suddenly wanted a life-size figure in the foreground, someone whose bewildered face looked straight at the viewers, making them feel part of the multitude too. By narrating this disorientating view of Cowcaddon streetscape in Lanark, the painting and the novel are ultimately fused together. Similarly, by including the ledger where both works began in this equation, the real and the imagined city become one, just as Unthank and Glasgow do. We see Cowcaddon streetscape in Alasdair's ledger within the real Glasgow. We see this location of the painting in the imagined Glasgow in Lanark, but we also see this view narrated to us in Unthank, Glasgow's dystopian counterpart. It says, "The cross was a place where several broad streets met, though the dark made it difficult to see far. Most of the sky was still black, for the paleness did not reach above the tenement roofs, so it seemed that two little days were starting, one at the end of each street." Again, we see the visual and literary connected through the ledger, but they are also both encapsulating Glasgow's industrial past. Alasdair said in an interview that Glasgow was often covered in soot contamination, preventing light to go through the lid, so it was dark most of the time. Therefore, the darkened world of Unthank that we read about in Lanark and see visually in Cowcaddon streetscape suggests that if Unthank is a parallel to Glasgow, then Cowcaddon streetscape could be viewed as the visual representation of Unthank. Cowcaddon streetscape can then take on a whole new shape when we consider the fragmentation and alienation of the lives and experiences of the people in Cowcaddons following the demolition of the area and the dispersal of people following the 1950s. In the painting, the subject's expressions encapsulate this feeling of uneasiness or anticipated change, which is the thematic impression within Lanark, with the character Lanark's amnesia of his past or the surreal and dark city he's found himself in. We see parallels in the fragmented nature of both Cowcaddon streetscape and Lanark. In Cowcaddon streetscape, we see it as a time shift, with the foregrounding faces both facing the viewer and then walking down Ann Street on the left. Similarly, this man standing next to the lamppost appears on the far right and also on the far left. In Lanark, with two narratives, one of Duncan thought and the other of Lanark, interwoven between these four parts that are told not in order, the fragmentation carries with it a sense of loss or anticipated nostalgia, as if Alasdair in Lanark was portraying the physical and social disconnection of Glasgow and Cowcaddon's post-motorway. With access to the resources within the archive, we can gain a deeper understanding of Alasdair's creative practice. We see how his response to the city of Glasgow was rooted in his resourcefulness, how he took ordinary Glaswegian people and places and reimagined them in pictures and words, and how reflecting on the creative process can be just as fascinating as the finished work is. Alasdair's ledger, which could have disappeared, offers insight into the social history of Cowcaddons and how he, as an artist and writer, interpreted and transformed this history into two major works. We see the interconnectivity between his work that spans over 65 years and how he preserved these ideas, placing them in new context by recycling his own material. His integration of his own life and the city's social history created works that tell the often overlooked narratives of Glasgow. However, we can only draw these conclusions through the Alasdair Gray archive, and the archive works in tandem with the principles that Alasdair adopted, offering a space that preserves his work, allows others to borrow seeds and make new work in a very tangible and accessible way. Without Alasdair's documentation of the city's forgotten or disappearing narratives, they might not exist. And similarly, without the archive preserving and sharing these stories, the Glasgow of the imagination that Alasdair created could end up being, as he described it, a lost civilization.